Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We'll be starting in 5 minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We'll be starting in 2 minutes. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining today's webinar, What Do We Teach Our Daughters? Nurses, Women, and Prosperity. I am Becky Schaefer, Global Program Manager at Sigma Theta Tau International. Sigma Theta Tau International, known as Sigma, has more than 135,000 members in 92 countries around the world. Our mission is advancing world health and celebrating nursing excellence in leadership, scholarship, and service. Our strength lies in the fact that our members are nurse leaders from all specialties. clinicians, educators, researchers, administrators, and more from different walks of life and from all over the world. Sigma is pleased to collaborate with Jhpiego, a longtime partner of Sigma and champion of nurses, to bring you today's webinar. Jhpiego is a global health nonprofit leader in bringing the life-saving care to women, children, and families who need it most. We are honored that their president and CEO, Dr. Leslie Mancuso, who is a nurse leader, is with us today. We would also like to thank our panelists, who you will meet shortly, for sharing their expertise with us today. Attendees are eligible for 1 contact hour as a result of today's webinar. Sigma is accredited as a provider of continuing nursing education by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The speakers and planning committee members have disclosed no conflicts of interest. To receive contact hours for this continuing nurse education session, participants are required to attend the webcast and complete the evaluation form, which will be emailed to all attendees approximately 2 days after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the Sigma repository within a few business days of recording. Alrighty, how you can participate. At the top right of your screen is a control panel. To open and close your control panel, click the orange arrow. Please submit your questions, thoughts, and comments via the questions panel throughout the discussion. What we would like everyone to do is to test this feature by entering the country from which you are joining us. Please take a moment to do so down in the questions field. Please make sure to hit the send button so the message makes it to us. It's always nice to see what countries are represented in our webinars. All right, now I'll turn the presentation over to Dr. Leslie Mancuso, Jhpiego's president and CEO, who will provide welcoming remarks. You have the floor, Leslie.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. Is there an echo? Are you hearing an echo? Let me take these out. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Leslie Mancuso, and I'm the president and CEO of Jhpiego. And I'm so thrilled to be part of this discussion on topics that are near and dear to my heart: nurse leadership, economic empowerment of women, and the professional relationship that can grow between mothers and daughters. I can certainly relate to all of these from my own history. I am always incredibly proud to tell everyone that I'm a nurse, and also the leader of one of the few nurse-led international health organizations in the world. In Jhpiego, 1 out of every 5 employees is a nurse or a midwife, and they contribute 19% of our published academic papers to the world. As well, we work with nurses around the world, and in particular, nursing associations around the world. Now, this didn't happen by chance. Jhpiego intentionally works to ensure that nurses and nurse leaders are involved in every part of our organization. And in fact, we work, I'm sorry, it's saying something. Are you still hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. I got something up on my screen. There is no doubt that we do this intentionally. So we have nurses as chiefs of party, as country directors, as senior technical advisors, as vice presidents, as senior directors of nursing and midwifery. We do this because I believe nurses can and should have any position they want. Their voices, nursing voices, are critical to being part of health decisions at the highest levels of global health. Why? Because before, during, and after emergencies, nurses are the backbone to helping our world reach its goals of universal health coverage. It's nurses that are going to extend primary health care services to all those that need it. Who better than nurses to understand and help the world know what's happening on the front lines of global health and helping the world know what is needed? We certainly see that now with this pandemic, as every community is dealing with COVID-19. It's never been clearer why investments in nursing, not after a crisis, are important to saving lives and protecting the livelihoods of all people. Without question, as we recover from this physically, emotionally, financially, from this very challenging time, we must prioritize an investment in nursing and education. The first ever State of the World's Nursing Report was released about a month ago, and it speaks to just this. It speaks to investing in nurses as individuals. It speaks to creating new jobs, and very importantly, it speaks to supporting nursing leadership in order for us to reach universal health care and protect the nurses that we say we value. The development of this incredible report was certainly a clear signal. If you measure what you value, then having a report that's measuring and looking at nursing says volumes about the importance of nurses having their voice in the global health conversation. Now, this report highlighted many issues, but certainly one was the need for decent working environment. Even if we are creating new jobs, that is futile if nurses don't have reliable employment and they don't have decent working conditions. As a profession where there are 90% are made up of women, we must continue to progress in pay equity. We must continue to look at auditing, hiring, and promotion practices, and we must enforce policies that prevent and address sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. We also must have future policies around an enabling working environment for women. For example, having flexible and manageable hours and accommodating the changing needs of women as nurses. And at the same time, we must have gender transformative leadership development opportunities for women in the workplace. We want energetic, broadly educated nurses that can identify and analyze problems, that can create new innovative solutions and act now. We need empowered nurses that are central to decision making and can provide quality patient-centered care to all those that need it, no matter where they live, no matter what their economic level is. To begin this, we must equal the playing field on pay and practice. We want nurses to be standing shoulder to shoulder with their contemporaries, regardless of their gender or their degree or their pay scale. In my own life, becoming a nurse opened professional doorways that I never expected when I joined this career. And like so many other nurses, my mother was a nurse and showed me the role of nursing and has continued to be my mentor and my supporter over these years. Now, I have accepted many different titles in my lifetime: business person, entrepreneur, advocate, but I am first and foremost a nurse. And when I travel around the world, so often people address me as doctor because I have a PhD. I am the first, before my introduction, to remind them to please say that I am a nurse, because it's important around the world for people to see nurses in many different positions, including leadership positions. In the current position I'm in, I have a front row seat in seeing the remarkable work of nurses around the world. I see that nurses are oftentimes the first and the only healthcare provider for communities, and thus they must have critical assessment and technical skills to be able to do their job. We see that now in the pandemic, as nurses are providing essential services to patients while at the same time trying to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. What we're also seeing is the role that nurses are playing as leaders working in a crisis, creating new innovative ways to handle the new and unknowns of COVID-19, while at the same time never waiting to be asked to do something, but doing what is right. There is no doubt that in this challenging moment, we are seeing what the world is seeing as nurses, something we already know, that nurses are resilient, that they're skilled, and that they are compassionate human beings. And with that, I think there's no better fitting way to introduce today's moderator than Jennifer Breeds, who is a Jhpiego senior nurse expert, as well as a gender expert. She is a leader for Jhpiego in so many areas, including having helped the development of the State of the World's Nursing Report. I introduce to you the moderator for today, Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you so much, Leslie, for the kind introduction, but also for just kicking us off on such an enthusiastic start with such energy and inspiration. So as Leslie mentioned, I am a technical advisor at Jhpiego and also practicing nurse here in Baltimore, and very honored to moderate today's panel. You know, something we've long suspected and now can articulate with evidence from the State of the World's Nursing Report is that nurses are not just at the front lines, we are the front lines. And as Leslie mentioned, of the 28 million of us globally, 90% are women. In fact, the health sector actually employs more women than any other sector. So this presents an incredible opportunity because it means that investing in nurses is investing in women, and ultimately also in healthier communities and stronger economies. Next slide. So as the nursing profession evolves and expands, our roles as nurses are also diversifying and pushing far beyond the traditional confines of hospital walls. And when we empower nurses, for example, through interprofessional education or collaborative practice models or expanded scopes of practice, we are also positioning women to be and to be seen as leaders throughout their communities and the organizations in which they work. Next slide. Nurses are valued. We are part of our own local communities. We share its culture, its strengths, and also vulnerabilities. And because of this, we're perfectly positioned from our trusted perspective at the front lines to co-design and deliver innovations that will shape the future of healthcare. Next slide. Nurses are also needed, particularly in low and middle income countries. So now more than ever is the time to focus not just on retaining experienced nurses, which is critical, but also in cultivating the next generation of nurse leaders, which is what we're here to talk about today. And ways we can do this include making sure that attractive, decent jobs are available and that the image of the modern nurse reflects the diversity of both our skill sets, but also of the populations that we serve. Next slide. Of course, many of us, I think, know all too well that nurses face challenges, and chief among them are gender inequalities, which create barriers that hold the nursing profession back from achieving its full potential. You know, female health workers, including nurses, are still paid less than their male counterparts. At Jhpiego, we hear from colleagues around the globe that traditional norms around women's independence, mobility, or working outside of the home can make it hard for women to pursue higher education in health. We also know there's a striking and frankly unacceptable disparity between women's contributions to delivering healthcare and our representation in leadership positions in health systems. So a report that was released last year by the WHO shows that even though women make up the vast majority of health workers worldwide, they occupy just 25% of leadership roles within the health sector. Next slide. And therefore, addressing challenges to nurses entering, remaining, and leading in the health sector is not just the right thing to do, it is an essential way forward in order to achieve universal health coverage goals. Next slide. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's really incredible panel of emerging and seasoned nurse leaders, beginning with Dawn Fitzgerald. Dawn is a doctoral student at Columbia University where she's pursuing her family nurse practitioner degree with a subspecialty in women's health. She currently works as a primary care nurse and plans to continue working in primary care as a nurse practitioner. Welcome, Dawn. I'm next very pleased to introduce Dr. Alicia Georges. Dr. Georges is a professor and chair of the Department of Nursing at Lehman College of the City University of New York. She also serves as the AARP's national president and as the past president of the National Black Nurses Foundation. Dr. Georges is also a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing. Welcome, Dr. Georges. And last but not least, we are joined by Arik Shimmick. Arik is a second career pediatric nurse and telehealth program manager at the Anne and Robert Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. And both Arik and Dawn serve as Sigma representatives to the United Nations. Arik in the role of a Sigma UN liaison and Dawn as a Sigma UN youth representative. Next slide. So as we transition now into the moderated portion of our panel discussion, we're going to have the opportunity to hear candid insights from our esteemed nurse panelists about their own unique journeys in navigating different stages of their careers in order to build a more prosperous future for themselves, but also for the profession. So next slide. Dr. Georges, I'd like to begin with you. A global survey of thousands of nurses that was conducted last year showed that nurses report their own lack of self-confidence as a major barrier to assuming leadership roles. In reflecting on your own exemplary career, I wonder if you or perhaps other nurses you've worked with have ever passed up opportunities because you felt unsure or insecure. And if so, what would have helped most in those situations?
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning to my colleagues worldwide. Yes, I do know nurses who have passed up opportunities because they felt insecure or unsure. And I equate that to how they have seen the role models within their communities and their cultures. I come from the United States Virgin Islands, the island of St. Thomas, and I grew up with a number of very strong women, strong leaders, some of them strong nurse leaders, nurse midwives, who really directed the care of populations in the Virgin Islands. So I myself did not feel insecure in what I could do and made it my business as my mentors. And my family constellation encouraged me to take on new roles because they had confidence in me as a person and felt that I could move on in doing what needed to be done. What's helped in most of these situations? Really having a network, having the resources that you can tap into, having people who look like you. I come from a racially ethnic group, having people who look like you who have been there. And it becomes aspirational and inspirational so that you then have an opportunity. And I say to nurses all over, step out, be bold, just ask, say, I could do that. I'm a nurse. I know about human caring. And you know what? They embrace you unless they just do not wish to have women within their organization or agency.
Thanks for sharing. I know that actually I was hearing similarly something Leslie often says is, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring your own chair. And I think that's a really powerful statement and something that we know in the literature and because of that survey that we need to be pushing and inspiring nurses to take that next step. And I think at the same time, having the structures in place to support them to do so. making sure that when we are putting together panels and task force and steering committees, that we hit a pause button and ask ourselves, is there a nurse here? And if not, let's go ahead and change that. And I think that's something that when we get outside of our nursing bubbles, that's where we're really looking for that as well from our colleagues, to a call to action to also support us in doing this. Thank you. Next slide, please. So Dawn, we know from literature that mentorship is a key driver for career success, yet often women can have a harder time than men identifying mentors, especially ones with influence. Wondering if you can share with us a bit about your own experiences in finding mentors and how these relationships influenced your life or career.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. So mentorship has been so extremely influential to me throughout my pursuit of becoming a nurse. Similar to Arik, I come to nursing as a second degree nurse. And as my first job in the kind of healthcare field, I was a nursing assistant, actually. And I think of that floor that I worked on as being in a lot of ways kind of my hive mind mentorship into nursing. I had so many great colleagues and friends just give me so many words of encouragement and tips and tricks to get through nursing school and how to kind of navigate finding future mentors for myself as well. And I think a lot of times people traditionally think of having a single mentor that guides them throughout their career. And I would say that in my experience, I've had a lot of unique opportunities and networking experiences to have mentors at different stages of my career development. And that's just been so invaluable because I've been able to kind of tap into all this great nursing knowledge about how to pursue what I want to do, and also, have the encouragement from all these great nurse leaders to say, yes, you can do that. And kind of similar to what Dr. Georges was saying, having confidence really does come from having this strong network and being surrounded by people that are encouraging you on a day-to-day. As far as establishing a relationship with mentors, I think, the first step is trying to identify the mentor that you want to have and kind of seeing in them what you want to be and how you want to pursue your own career. And then just reaching out and saying, hey, would you mind grabbing a cup of coffee, or can I, get your email and just discuss with you a couple of ideas or, advice that you have about your life and how you've kind of gone through what you've accomplished in your career. And that's always been super fruitful for me. And I've never had anybody turn me down or say no. And I've always gotten so much out of that. So I would encourage anybody who's maybe feeling a little bit shy about reaching out to somebody is to just do it and, know that what you'll get out of that, even if it's just a brief, email back and forth, it will be super helpful throughout your entire career. And I will say that while I've been very fortunate to have a lot of female mentors and leaders in my career, it is not lost on me at all. And as Jennifer said at the beginning of the program, that while healthcare is predominated by women globally, only 25% of healthcare leaders are held by women. So I think depending on the role that you see yourself in and what you're kind of pursuing, sometimes it can be really difficult to find a mentor that is, you see yourself representative in a leadership role. And of course, that isn't unique to just gender. There's also needs to be an acknowledgement of intersectionality and the promotion of a diverse set of women in leadership roles. And I'll just wrap up with the last piece of this question, kind of the best advice that I've gotten from a mentor in my life. I'll say that it's to be resilient and to lean into the discomfort that you sometimes feel as being, a woman and a nurse, and just being maybe the only woman or nurse at a table, and speaking up for the profession and feeling the confidence to say, these setbacks happen, but I'll have the resilience to keep pursuing them.
Thanks so much, Dawn. And Arik, I'd be interested to hear, your response for the same question, drawing from your unique experience as a male in a female-dominated profession.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. Kind of to dovetail off of some of the points that Dawn made, I think, we live and work in an incredible profession, and as the adage goes, it takes a village. I think when you look at my role and transition into nursing, I would argue it probably took several villages because it was a lot of work to transition back to school in my 30s, and it required a lot of support from many different people. So kind of thinking first who some of my first mentors were, I always looked to my mother. We grew up in a single parent household, and she was an incredibly strong person who really guided us into thinking, how can we best help other people? And that was a big push for me to get into nursing. And I also have an aunt who is in the field. So those two people were kind of the first mentors I reached out to about this crazy idea I had of like, I'm going to go save the world through nursing. And they both kind of shook their head and said, well, that sounds great. Let's go do it. So once you get into looking at schools and things like that, I had a lot of really great opportunities with professors at my university. For example, I did serve in a role as our vice president of the Student Nurses Association. So I met a lot of faculty and just other administrators from the university through that. And I think had the opportunity to really connect with all of these people at different parts of the education process, who were 100% completely female. I don't really remember having a lot of male mentors through the school process, but still to this day, those are the mentors that I seem to come back to when I'm looking at a fork in the road, or I'm looking at, how can I do what I'm doing a little bit better? So finding that person while you're in school, I think is incredibly important. And even as you're transitioning into your first job, or for those of us who are coming into the field as a second career nurse, it's overwhelming to start that first position and you're worried about the science and the tasks and did I do everything in the right order? But I encourage you to really strongly continue looking for a mentor at that important part of your career, because that's where you really need a lot of support. And even as Dawn said, if it's someone to grab a coffee with and say, I just have to be honest with someone that I really could use, a helping hand or a shoulder to cry on. That's a big piece of mentoring. It's not always about how do I grow professionally. Sometimes it's, for me at least, it was about how do I survive this? And how do I manage the emotion of becoming a nurse, especially in pediatrics, which is, can be at times a very emotionally difficult field to work in. So when it comes to looking for mentors, I think men in the field, because we still stand out a little bit, probably have an easier time to do, to find people to connect with. But never be afraid to reach up the ladder and say, I'm interested in what you do. I'm interested in your field. Can we get together and talk about what that might look like? Because the number of 25%, leadership positions being held by women is absolutely like mind-boggling and wrong and needs to be fixed immediately. So how we do that is by reaching back to the people who are coming up through what we just went through and, giving them the advice that we got of, trust your gut, go for the opportunity that you love, go for the job that gets you excited, and all the money and the schedule and the logistics and all of that will fall into place. But if you're on the right path, I think you'll naturally find mentors along the way. And I certainly was very lucky to do that.
Thanks. Something particularly in light of, the global pandemic that we're all nurses everywhere are challenged with. I really think about the new grads right now and the unique challenge. It's tough enough to survive your first year as a nurse and to have that added complexity and fear. I actually, I'm curious. I know, Dr. Georges, you are in New York City right now. I'm just curious if you've had experience in mentoring and, given your work in the schools and in the colleges around this, if, how you make yourself available as a mentor or how you've experienced students coming to you for mentorship opportunities and if you've noticed anything different now.
Well, very honest with you, I have always had an open door as a chair, as a faculty member. Students have my home phone number, my cell phone number that my faculty thinks is awful, but I give it to them anyway. They can text me, they can call me. One of the key things is this pandemic and how awful it's been for our practicing nurses who are frontliners here in New York City. Having lost 3 of my graduates, to this pandemic, that's been one of the worst things that's happened. But the key thing is that I allow my students who have been so desperate. I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychiatrist, but just to know that they had an opportunity to call me and say, what should I do? There's no PPE. Call the health department. Here's the phone number. Those kinds of things. Call your union rep. The kinds of support that nurses on the front line needed during this period of time. Not attempting to be disruptive, but rather to be advocates on behalf of patients and their colleagues. It's been a very trying time and emotional time for me and for most of our faculty, because our graduates are also the people who have been disproportionately affected in the New York City area and across this country in the deaths and the morbidity, because they're Black and Hispanic. And the Black men who are dying and who are fathers and husbands and children of our graduates and our members, our students. That's been very trying. And I think having an opportunity, and the other thing, I'm a Zoom user, so I have town hall meetings. I just Zoom students and have them call and talk, and I email them, and they don't have to. It's just an opportunity. So I do it for both the graduate and undergraduate students. So that's been students say to me, even though they may not like their grade, hey, it was great being able to talk to somebody. We've got to use different techniques and respond to the crisis at the time. But the whole underlying piece is that people have to feel that there's somebody they can depend on, a resource that they can go to. And if I don't have it, send them to somebody else. The other night, somebody called me from one of the institutions and said, we're having a call with 40 nurses. Could you just call in for 2 minutes and give them a boost and motivate them? And I did. I didn't know half of them were my former graduates, but I did that. And then I cried after, because these were folks on the front line. They just wanted a boost. They knew I was not going to change the situation, but just to know that somebody else identifies with them and understands what's happening.
Wow. I mean, and I think about the needs, for psychological first aid. And I think, the nursing profession is unique in that someone said, we're the profession that's there during people's most miraculous life moments and also their most challenging, they're absolutely most difficult. And at baseline, that can take a toll on our own mental health and then how we continue to, interact in our families and in our social networks. And when we have a second shift to come home to and continue, needing to move forward, I think that's difficult. And it sounds like what I'm hearing is that the role of a mentor, but even just perhaps a peer support network or a group that you can turn to of someone else who fundamentally shares the experience because of a shared experience as a nurse, that they've been there and having that is really critical, really critical. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide. So Alicia, actually back to you. Given the deeply gendered nature of the nursing profession, I'm curious how gender biases have impacted your own career or the careers of other women you know. And have you noticed any changes in the types of challenges that you encountered when you first started your career compared to now?
Interesting question. The gender biases that I had during my early career paralleled the issues and the gender biases that were existent in the overall society here in the United States. Women didn't hold the kinds of roles that they do now. I'm proud to say I've been a nurse for over 50 years. It's my 55th year graduation this year. And so think back, historically, women did not have positions of power in the United States. We talked about a glass ceiling. We saw the rise of now because women were not given equal rights and having the opportunity for equal employment. I had a double whammy. I was a female in nursing, or maybe it's triple, and a Black woman in the time when there were inequities throughout the society for people of color. So coupled with that, it was very difficult. Very difficult, but resilience is what Dawn kept talking about, and what my parents always said to me, you can bounce back, you got the guts and the stamina. But it was hard. And what I see now is the opportunities that younger folks coming into the profession now have. The biases remain, because when you look overall, look at CEOs in this country. How many of them are women? I'm not talking just about nurses. I'm talking about in business and in manufacturing and in academia, presidents of colleges, not deans of nursing, but presidents of universities and colleges. We still see that gap. But what is happening now is we've got to still speak the truth. We have to still use the data to drive changes. There are still many challenges for us and for me. Now it's ageism, and that's happening to many women as you look at the age of the nurses in this country. I can't speak for globally. I didn't remember the actual age range in the report, but in the United States. So it's ageism and how people are responding to nurses, and they're being women. And so they're again being placed in that position. Look at what's happening though. Again, it's paralleling what's happening in the larger society. Everybody who's a CEO seems to be 20 years old, but they're younger. And so these are the continuing challenges we're going to have to face. The fight doesn't end, Jennifer. The battle continues. But we've got new techniques. We use now the data and the science to inform our policymakers. And we now have people who are advocates and who will begin to drive some more changes. As my career ebbs, I'm here to encourage all the younger nurses, and particularly females, that they do not have to tolerate. There are things called laws, and biases and discriminatory practices that must be addressed, and they can't shy away from it.
No, I think, it's an interesting follow-up question is what can be done to address these gender biases that are so ingrained, not just in nursing, but in our society writ large. And when we are talking about a profession that is often sort of pushed to the outskirts of policymaking, leadership, decisions in health systems, and yet we're the ones who are delivering the bulk of care, it really makes you wonder just how much of that is around gender biases. And so what do we need to do immediately to shift those norms and to change them? I'm curious if I'll open this up to all of you to chime in, but are there any sort of immediate steps that we could be taking now? I'm thinking about how we position nursing as a STEM science, as not a soft skill. This isn't, caring for people. It's a technical skill, and sort of shifting that to draw in new people that reflect that, it's not just women, but, there are men in nursing. In fact, we know we need more of them in order to drive primary healthcare goals. I'm just curious if there's any other sort of immediate next steps or even intermediate or longer term changes that you all hope to see to address these biases.
I can speak real quickly. First of all, and I'm not promoting AARP, but we do have the campaign, the Center to Champion Nursing in America. And if nobody else, it's housed at AARP, it's an RWJ and an AARP initiative. And the campaign drives, and we don't just talk to each other, we talk to everybody. So these are folks who are out there getting allies and building networks with other people, not just nurses, to really promote what nursing does, what nursing is, how we are every place, and that we need to be in the boardroom just as much as we need to be at the bedside, and how we get the Nursing on Boards Coalition. How do we get those? It started at AARP. It's now its own freestanding organization. How do we get nurses on boards who can influence? Not just hospital boards, but other boards that can really inform policymakers. How do we get people elected? That's the only thing I said, that I wasn't sure I really wanted to be caught up in the politics of the Bronx. So I didn't feel insecure. I just said, no, I wouldn't run for an office. But it's those are the kinds of things. I would like to see Dawn and Eric run for an office, push, because that's where you can begin to make some differences. But we got to stop just talking to ourselves and begin to talk to other people.
Yeah, I think, do you want to jump in, Arik?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in because I 100% agree. I think nurses as a profession and as kind of a personality type, we do a really great job talking to each other, but we don't always tell our story to other people outside of our circle. And so doing that is such a powerful piece that every single person can, implement at any phase of their own career. And thinking really broadly about where else could I serve as the nursing voice? Is there a city council position or maybe something in city planning? Because we now know that so much of the healthcare crises we are facing really relate to where we live, how we get to work, and what it is we eat. So don't be afraid to not only get involved at your own institution, but really look outside of it and say, who might not know anything about the world of nursing, and how can I be friends with them? Because that's where that story is going to make a great connection. And the second point that I'd like to make, and this is one I kind of had to learn the hard way, but I really encourage all of us to consider stopping the term male nurse. Dropping male from this title and this discussion, because the minute you tell me something is different, then I'm going to expect it to be, when in fact we're not. And so ultimately, if I introduce myself as a male nurse, although that is true, it is actually setting up this dichotomy of, well, is one better than the other, or how are they different? And that's a space where we spend time discussing when we really don't need to, because nurses are nurses. And I loved your point earlier, Dr. Georges. I'm like, I'm a nurse, I can do that. That is a phrase that any one of us around the world can say. So I really work hard to try to not say, oh yes, I'm a second career male nurse, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter anymore.
So, we never hear someone say, I'm a male physician, or I'm a male pharmacist or female pharmacist. It's, but we hear that in the social media, in movies about a male nurse, and I couldn't agree more. I think we need to change the image, and that's going to be key for attracting the next generation and of pulling youth and men into our profession, which we need. We know, in theory, could also be a way to shift the gender biases and how gendered our profession has become.
Yeah, and when you really look at it, the value of having a caretaker that looks like you, talks like you, maybe someone that you can really associate with, because honestly, our profession is challenged to do some very personal and intimate things at times. Mm-hmm. And especially in the world of pediatrics, an 11-year-old male might respond very differently to a male nurse when it comes to some of those things. So getting more men into the profession is a huge challenge for all of us, but it's going to be such a worthwhile cause, because the benefit and the value of having a nurse that looks like you and can kind of know where you're coming from is I think huge in our profession.
Yeah, and I know in some of our Jhpiego programs, we have seen in certain contexts and settings that nursing has become sort of a launch pad into medicine for males. That tends to be a common, or becoming common in certain settings, a trajectory. And so how can we keep men in the profession? Well, it's by making this respectable work with a decent pay, with, safe working conditions. I think that's how we lift up the entire profession, not just to make it more attractive for one subset, but for everyone, and all of us will benefit from that. I'm curious, Dawn, I don't know if you had something to add there, but I had one more question on this point before we move on, but I wanted to see if you had anything else to add.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think all of the points that Dr. Georges and yourself and Arik have brought up are things that I've also, thought about before and totally wholeheartedly agree with. And then the only thing that I'll add too is that another thing that's so pervasive about nurses is the way that we are represented in social media and just media at large. If you watch any of the popular medical drama shows, you'll see, the nurses are barely doing anything in these shows, and it's, surgeons that are drawing blood or, starting IV lines, and we just know that that's not true. And it kind of demeans our profession to say that we're, just on the wayside and just taking orders and not, doing our own assessments and not doing our own critical thinking. So I think kind of at large too, there has to be a better representation in the general public of who we are and what we do and how much we bring to the table in healthcare.
Absolutely. And I think even in media now, when I think about the coverage of COVID, we had an interesting conversation within Jhpiego community of nurses because we weren't seeing nurses in the media. We were hearing physicians telling our stories. We're again delivering the vast majority of care. And immediately the journalists and the media and the policymakers go to, positions that tend to have in a very hierarchical system of healthcare services that we have, tend to go to the top. And again, that also tends to cluster with men and physicians. And so that's really problematic because it doesn't, it's undermining our competency, our abilities, our contributions, our voice, and also our ability to say what we need on a global stage in order to work and to work safely and to do our jobs well. Even in Maryland, we don't have a nurse on. It was a close colleague and mentor of mine drew to my attention that we don't have a nurse on our state steering committee for COVID response. And that's like, oh, well, I wonder what other states do. That might not be all that different, frankly, from state to state. So not just in journalism, but as we said, in the actual bodies that are making these decisions. I think the last point that I wanted to touch on before we move on to our next sort of topical area here is around, interprofessional education and collaborative practice and the roles of nurses. I think we hear those terms, but there's also this problematic situation, particularly in the States, but I think globally, where nurses don't always have the scope of practice to contribute as fully empowered members of those collaborative teams. And I think that really changes the image and how our leadership is perceived and the type of voice that we are sort of permitted to share in those models. And I really see that as something, when we talk about how do we champion women, we need to get those nursing practice acts changed so that it actually reflects what we know how to do, and that we're not just, I volunteered for an organization and I wasn't allowed to give insulin in a shelter because that's not what that wasn't part of the bylaws of this response organization. And I thought, well, no wonder you are having a trouble recruiting, getting volunteers in, because what nurse would want to join and then not be able to do what they're absolutely able to do? So I just wonder, are you having those similar experiences, or if you have anything to add around interprofessional education, collaborative practice, and sort of more empowered scope?
Well, I'm going to jump in, and these two young people who are out there on the front lines can tell you more. But one of the big issues we've had in this country is we have not come together as nursing organizations within states to help to write what needs to be in the Practice Acts. Again, I'm an old timer in this profession. I remember marching with Claire Fagan and a bunch of folks from NYU just to get our Nurse Practice Act change in New York so that they didn't have anybody telling us how to practice nursing or having to work under their supervision. People were upset with us. Why are you acting like this? You got a job. It's irrelevant. I come back to my same issue. We have got to have others who understand. Again, I'm not here promoting AARP, but I will tell you that AARP has driven these changes in nurse practice acts to have nurses practice to the highest level of their education in states across this country. And you know who have opposed a lot of this? The hospital associations and some of the other nursing groups, because there've been divisiveness. But patients and consumers want nurses. They want us to practice to the highest. I can only speak, I know in the Virgin Islands where I come from, I have a license to practice there, but we're America. But those nurses have a huge scope of practice. They're not that many of them. Other parts of the world, nurses are doing things without the authority. And so we have got to figure out, and that's why I love you guys in Jhpiego. You can help in helping to build the policy changes that need to come from the ground up to get those local governments to change the practice acts.
I can't just, I can't help to wonder, do we see the same types of dynamics around practicing power and ability in male-dominated professions? I just can't help but wonder if there are deep down gendered norms and biases at play here. Dawn or Art, did you have anything else to add?
Sure. I'll just say, it wasn't too long ago, and I'm in fact still in school for my nurse practitioner degree, that going through school, we're on the same campus as a lot of the other professions in the healthcare. So, occupational therapy, physical therapy, medicine, and we had so little real meaningful interaction with the other schools. And it just seems like such a lost opportunity when schools and universities don't do more interprofessional, kind of collaboration from the get-go, like knowing what it's like to be a nurse, knowing what the nurse's scope of practice is, knowing what the physician's scope of practice is, knowing what PT does, knowing what OT does. I have a couple of, good friends that are physicians, are going through medical school, and they still to this day don't really truly know, I think, what the nurse's scope of practice is. And then also, the nurse practitioner scope of practice, just understanding what a nurse practitioner is. I think for the general public, people don't understand that role. And I think a lot of the times maybe have been seen by nurse practitioners, but just assumed that it was a physician because they just couldn't even tell the difference. And, there wasn't any sort of way for them to understand that this is, an advanced practice nurse and that you're being taken care of by someone who is an advanced trained nurse, and you're getting, quality care and have, just as good outcomes as if you were being treated by a physician.
Arik, I see you nodding. I don't want to move on if there was something else you wanted to add.
No, I mean, I've been nodding now for an hour because I'm like, yep, 100% agree. But, I think the only thing I would add on is I feel like maybe now more than ever, this is truly our moment. We have, recognition from the WHO and other groups that this is the year of the nurse and the midwife. But on top of that, for 15 years, I think we've been the #1 most trusted profession. But all those things are nice to say and nice to write in pieces, but at the end of the day, we're going to come out of this pandemic, and I really do believe have the ear of many people that never would have wanted a nurse at the table. So this is the chance, this is the year to step back and say, what's the thing that I disagree with the most? And who can I go talk to about that? Because the role and profession of nursing and midwifery it has never been more visible. It has never been more important in the eyes of the people that we serve. So don't delay. Now's our time.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to the next slide and question. All right. So, something that Leslie alluded to in her remarks and that we know is a common theme is around workplace violence and sexual violence in the health sector, which we know is widespread and often hidden, and that female health workers, including nurses, face a disproportionate burden of violence and sexual harassment. And this in turn will limit women's ability to perform their job and pursue new opportunities and advancements, and certainly leads to attrition, poor health, and certainly decreased motivation and morale. So, Dawn, I'm curious, from your perspective, what needs to be done to address this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what Dr. Georges had said earlier, where, the state of the world kind of really affects, and the gender roles really reflect in nursing, because nursing is so predominantly female. So, a lot of the kind of gender disparities that we see in the world at large are also totally reflected in nursing. And the fact that nurses face this disproportionate burden of violence and sexual harassment is a way that I think a lot of people and colleagues and patients even, exert power over nurses because they believe that they can. I think that a couple of steps that can be taken, and we already touched on a few of them, but to combat these issues of harassment and violence are, as you were saying, just education to the general public about understanding that nursing is a science-based profession, that it's not just taking orders or that it's a service job, that it's instead a technical, STEM-based science profession, and that we need the backing of governments and our employers and individuals to recognize that nursing is, nurses are highly trained in public health matters, and that we're intimately involved in the day-to-day patient care and are just such a highly valuable asset. And something else that was brought up in the State of the World's Nursing Report was that all of these organizations and governments really need to implement these zero tolerance policies for violence and verbal and physical and sexual harassment. And just say, we're not going to tolerate this, and that nurses should feel supported by their leadership and comfortable coming forward to report these instances of harassment. I think, something to note about that too is just as a profession at large, nursing, there's this kind of phrase that's out there that nurses eat their young, and that there is, in some cases, this type of horizontal bullying that goes on in the nursing profession. And I think a lot of that has to do with this feeling that nurses need to kind of haze you in a way to be able to deal with all of the instances of harassment that you face in a day-to-day in the workplace, and that nurses have gone through this for so long now that there needs to be some sort of, stop of, hey, why is this happening, and what can we do to fix this, and what are the real systemic issues here that kind of promote this horizontal violence. So I think on an individual level, cultivating an environment in your workplace that really allows for your colleagues to grow and to feel like they can make a mistake and that they can speak up if they do, and to feel safe in that, and just promoting that throughout your entire work and your career as you go along. And then we've already kind of touched on this, but I just think systemically there needs to be more nurses in leadership positions. Leadership reflects value. So if there are no nurses in high-level positions, it can only lead people to believe that nurses aren't an important part of the healthcare system, which we know is not true. Oh, Jennifer, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Dawn, I couldn't agree more. And we also know from research in ways to prevent workplace harassment and violence is that, by having women in leadership roles within organizations, that actually the organizational culture will shift and is less likely to promote cultures that perpetuate violence and harassment, and that there's less likely to be that. And so that, again, elevating nurses, elevating women, I think could play a really important part of prevention, as you said. Anything else on this topic before we move on? I know we're covering so much, and I want to make sure we get through the end here in our last minutes together. Okay, let's move to our next slide. So Arik, when we, again, talk about the nursing profession, I'm curious, from your perspective, what can men and women do in order to be better workplace allies for women at various stages of their nursing careers? And What is the role of men for ensuring that these types of gender issues that we just talked about are addressed in the workplace around leadership and workplace safety?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest thing that men in our profession can do is really to, constantly advocate in new ways, both internally and externally, for gender equality, but also to stand up and challenge when you run into the inequality in your everyday life. And it's not always easy to do, and understandably, I think it makes a lot of us nervous to challenge our superiors, but part of that is how you change the culture. And I think doing it in a respectful way is really the onus or the mandate that we need to give new nurses, both male and female, because ultimately, if we want to be treated the same, we need to treat each other the same and stand up for each other when things are not necessarily going the way that they should. So you'll have to forgive me, but since I work in pediatrics, I do use a lot of pediatric references, but I don't know if I can say the name of the movie, but it involves an ice princess that maybe some of you have seen. But in the second version of this movie, there was a moment where Kristoff, comes into a situation where Anna is clearly in control. And instead of saying, stand back or stop what you're doing, I'll take over, he just looks at her and says, I'm here. What do you need? And I think that was such a weird moment. Like, I still get goosebumps even saying that line, because how often do we teach, especially young boys, it is not your job to take over. It is your job to help if it's needed. And that was like such a tangible example in pediatrics. I was like telling everyone, have you seen this? Have you seen this? And so that piece also comes into play of, how do we meet our coworkers in the middle and understand that both men and women have roles in the informal economy as much as we do in the formal one. Whether you're a part of the sandwich generation, whether you've got young kids at home, whatever the case is, you often have hours of work to do after you come home. And if you don't respect that about your coworkers and give them a little bit of a grace to say, maybe that interaction we had was a little bit, tense or uncomfortable, but I understand that there's a lot going on right now. It just gives all of us the space to be a human being. And when you couple that with having, a team of men around you working with women who say, I'm not here to fix things, I'm here to help if you need me. That's kind of my big takeaway there. And I think as Dr. Mancuso mentioned in her opening as well, it's being really smart and thoughtful about how we hire and how we promote, and how, here in Chicago, we have a great collaboration on the west side of the city, which is really focused on making sure that we are not only buying supplies from small businesses in those areas, but we're providing educational opportunities to people who live in those zip codes, because those people are a lot of our patients and our families, and we see them every day, and we can lift a community and a profession by bringing more of those families into the nursing profession. So thinking thoughtfully how, you might partner with another organization or healthcare system to buy better, to hire smarter, to be more engaged in, what does the community college situation look like for the nursing program? Is it easy enough to get into and easy enough to afford? What are the things that we could do there? So, promoting, hiring, all these come into play. And I think at the end of the day, just, again, I hate referring to myself as a male nurse, but admittedly, I am 10% of this profession, and it is important to come in and not take over.
Dawn or Alicia, anything to add?
I think that one of the things that we need to learn to do better, I think Eric and Dawn said it, is we have to learn how to communicate amongst ourselves about what our needs are, and whether it's male or female, but right there and then. And one of the things that people don't talk to each other, some people on units don't even know the names of the people from different shifts. They don't see them. They don't talk to them. So there's no way they can form a bond. And so there's no way, I don't know what's happening on first shift versus second or third, or shift 1 and 2 to 12 and 12, because people aren't talking to each other. And if we begin to do that, we can then define for ourselves. I don't want anybody telling me what to do, but define for ourselves what we need. And then finding the people who've got the money to go out and bring in the resources that we need to help us along our careers. So that we should have somebody within our institutions telling us, take this leadership course. Here's a way that you can communicate. Here's the way you can get involved in politics. Here's the way you lobby. Here's the way you advocate. All the kinds of things that we need. This is what you need to do. Dress to impress. I don't know that still goes, but I learned that within my career stuff with folks within the organization who felt they were helping you along the way. So there's a number of techniques and strategies, tactics, not just strategy, but tactics that we could use.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned politics there, because I think one amazing thing we could do for each other, and this plays into all sorts of topics that we touched on today, but getting people to talk to each other about things like being registered to vote or going to vote in your local and national elections.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter who you support or what your viewpoint is, but I do strongly believe that every viewpoint and person should be heard. So being an ally to each other in things that maybe aren't necessarily quote unquote work related, but they do influence our work life because of all the topics we've talked about, from gender to workforce to just the changing roles of everyone in today's society. So being politically active, I think, is a huge point.
Yeah, and I remember in my first year as a nurse, I actually had to work on election day, 12-hour shift. So I didn't have a way to drive to get from the end of my shift, which of course goes over 12 hours when you had a long day and you still are doing reporting out and documentation, but I actually couldn't vote because I couldn't get there in time. And I think about, what does that mean for women's voices in certain systems? If the majority of people in healthcare are women, I just think it has this ripple effect into other systems where our voices need to be heard loud and clear. I just wonder if there's anything else, Dawn or Alicia, from your perspective, that you wish that women or men would do differently to be a workplace ally for women specifically. From your perspective as women, I think Arik had a great point about men not taking over and just sort of saying, here you are, I'm here. But I wonder, if there's anything else from your perspective that you would like to see happening.
Form a committee of male mentors, and female mentors that can work together. See, we tend to have committees that are more like us. So if we can make sure that, and I don't mean they have to be, get the CFO to be a mentor, get the head of housekeeping, bring them together, let's talk. More than likely, the housekeeping person is a woman and the CFO is a man. But if we can bring those and we can begin to build those kinds of units around, and that we can then do blocks, they become blocks that we build on for our all our nurses, for everybody, but for women to see that men are like, I love Arik's stuff. They're not coming to tell us what to do, but they're there to help us if we need. Nurses don't know budgeting. In many instances, we didn't learn it in our baccalaureate programs, so we're now teaching it, but in mine we didn't a long time ago. But one of the things that we could do, bring them in. Let them begin to help us so that we can get to that table and say, this doesn't work in this revenue stream, and that expense output is not good. But bring them into the mix. That's how we begin to build, to get better allies for women. When we can reach out to them, but they also can reach out to us, and we're not telling each other, or there to, I forgot the word Arik used, to take over, for us, but to be assistive in our development.
Mm-hmm. Or to use their voice and power and privilege to lend opportunities, perhaps, to the nurses, to say, oh, this task force is forming. I have a great idea. Let's open it up to this nurse who I know would have great ideas, and she's really looking for leadership, but be intentional. Dawn?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with what everyone's been saying. I also think, we've obviously all known this for a while now, but I think in the light of the pandemic, a lot of things have been brought to the forefront, which is, this whole idea of women taking on this burden a lot of times of the traditional women's work, which is, the household chores, and then a lot of parents now doing homeschooling at home, and it predominantly falling on women. There was this great headline in the New York Times recently that was said nearly half of the men say they do most of the homeschooling, and then in smaller text it was like 3% of the women agree. So I think just like the acknowledgement that there is kind of a different burden on women when they get home from that 12-hour or 13-hour, 14-hour shift, what they're expected to do when they get home. And maybe there isn't time to do, those certifications, your chemo certification or your med-surg certification, because you're doing all these extra things at home, and that really prevents kind of the pushing forward of, trying to achieve all of these new things. So I think organizationally too, that it needs to be recognized that sometimes you need maybe a day to be able to pursue those kinds of things. That's, not a shift day, but a day where you're just there and, doing training and getting higher education that can be counted towards a work day, but that is, set aside specifically for that.
That's a great point. It's so difficult too when you have a mandatory team huddle at the very end of a night shift when you're rushing to get home to take care of getting kids off to school or other priorities, but we know that those types of things happen, and I think it's just from a gender blind perspective, it's just not considering some of these issues, and ideally a gender transformative lens would help us to shift that dynamic. But in the meantime, at least recognizing it and accommodating around it as we work to transform. Alicia, I don't want to cut you off. I saw you nodding.
I'm agreeing.
Great. All right. Well, in these last about 8 minutes we have here before we move into Q&A with the audience, I wanted to go to our final question so we can shift the slide. I'd like to hear, now from each of you, how you think the global pandemic and the world's reliance on nurses now more than ever presents an opportunity for positive changes in our profession, not just for all of us currently in the profession, but for generations to follow. So Alicia, we'll start with you.
Well, I really firmly believe that we have to begin to look at the facts of the social determinants and what has happened in this whole pandemic globally. And that we as nurses, I firmly believe, are in a position because we are in every setting in which we have seen people ravaged by this disease. And so we need to have the opportunity in academic nursing, in practice, and in research to begin to look at community as our partner. Community is where the problems begin, and community is where the problems have to be resolved. So if we can go back and reinfuse, I had it when I was a student at Seton Hall. I'm not promoting Seton Hall today either, but at Seton Hall University, we were infused with the public health issues and public health science. Then all of a sudden, in nursing, we all became, acute care was the way to go. That's not where it is. We've got to reframe and rethink in this 200th year of the birth of Florence Nightingale and the International Year of Nurse and Midwife, that when you look globally, our nurses globally are primary care practitioners. They are in community. We have got to shore up by reimbursement, by the way we have the image of those folks in community, the working and the intersection of community NGOs and us as professional associations to begin to do something. We have got to do it now. We can't wait for the next pandemic. Say, oh, we should have taught them how to do public health science. But I knew it. I couldn't figure out how the other people couldn't figure it out, but I knew what it was. But how we need to do it. We got to do it now. Don't misunderstand me. Acute care has to have its place, but we have to send people back from where they came from. And that's where we need to shore up. And I tell you what, the community will love us. They want to be healthy. They don't want to die, 100 and some thousand people. They don't want to die. They want it to be as active and as healthy. They want to live the good life too. Let's partner with them to do that.
Thank you. Arik, do you want to chime in next?
Yeah, opportunities abound, and unfortunately, we have to live through such a terrible thing in order for some of these paradigm shifts to happen. But, when we talk about the general public using the term heroes to refer to nurses and other frontline providers, it's sometimes and in some ways changing a lot of people's minds about the role that we play and the value that we add to healthcare. And I agree, to your point of, really making sure that as much health care and wellness occurs in the community before we get to the acute care setting, as we see so many, especially reimbursements being tied to, outcomes and return rates and things like that, you're going to see a lot more healthcare happen in the home and in the community. And that's a big opportunity for us here after this pandemic. But the other two things I was kind of scribbling notes here is I think overall the health literacy of most people has gone up significantly as we use more technology to try to figure out, exactly what does this mean. I don't think that, we've created a whole new world of, public health people to study the virus process per se, but I do think that people are getting more comfortable asking questions about their own health, asking about their risk of transmission and what this means for their families. And so I think that's a benefit to come from this is people feel more comfortable with the topic of their own bodies and their own health. And I hope that leads to them taking a larger role in their own healthcare.
Yeah, self-care is a huge, it's becoming more important now than ever, and nurses' role in supporting that so that it's safe and with high quality and rolls down effectively. It's a great point.
And I think we're even more connected now than we ever were before. We know we live in a global society, and with our large cities having airports that receive over 100 international flights a day, we know that this is a real potential and a real risk now. So I think that's one of the benefits of Sigma having a role at the United Nations is we get the chance to really come and represent nursing and the nursing voice to a lot of people that maybe hadn't considered it before, and a chance to work with these global organizations. So the nursing profession, I think, is going to get more global at the same time as our patients get more smart about their own health.
Great. And last but not least, Dawn, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I thought, similar to I'm sure everyone, I thought a lot about what our healthcare system is going to look like, after all of the dust kind of settles and, just the systemic effects that it's had on our economies and just, in all aspects and walks of people's lives. And I'll say I hope to be, a practicing primary care provider by the end of this year. And it is, daunting to think about this kind of new world that we're starting, especially in primary care, where, a lot of it's telehealth now. And Arik, I'm sure you know a lot more about that than even I do in your work. But just the idea of, communicating with your patients in, in this manner, for example, over a Zoom call, or, just seeing their faces and not really, asking them to maybe zoom in on the body part that they're telling you about. But it's just opening up kind of a whole new world of what it means to be caring for your patients. And then I also think, similar to what Dr. Georges was saying, I have really high hopes, and I think that a lot of nurses feel the same, that this will kind of, shine a brighter light on the disparities of health that we are seeing, and just the abysmal rates of death in our communities of color, and that we need to be focusing in on that, and what can we do to change that, and how can we combat that, in which ways, and new innovative solutions for how that can change.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you all so much. This has been a really tremendous discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. So I want to take the opportunity to thank you and now turn it back over to our colleagues from Sigma to see if there's any questions from the audience that we can now help to respond to.
Hello, everyone. This concludes the thoughtful panelist presentations. We'll now take questions from our audience. Please submit your questions, thoughts, and comments via the questions panel. If you have not done so already, please also submit which country you are joining us from. There are some questions that have come in already. Is there a source on what the effect has been of COVID on nurses? I would assume that more nurses are getting sick and have sadly died, but when I looked for that information, I couldn't find it. All info I found was healthcare workers were lumped all together. We have to highlight the nurses in this crisis, especially in the Year of the Nurse. I'll open that up to anyone that knows of any resources that are nurse specific.
There's some emerging data that's now being put together. I live in New York State, and it's been driven by the collective bargaining units to really look at how many nurses have been affected. There was a small blurb, not very scholarly, but a small blurb the other day in one of the news media that nurses in the emergency room were not testing as positive as in other parts of the institution or in even the, I guess, community. I don't know how much, I don't know what the N was, what the power was of the data that they gathered, but it's beginning to emerge. And you know what? We must insist on it.
I think there's also, I'm part of the ANA, and I know that they also have their own kind of subset of research into how the pandemic and COVID-19 has affected nurses. That's still ongoing. I think a lot of information is still coming in, but that's a good resource too, I think.
Yeah, and I can add, I know this is of utmost priority for the International Council of Nurses, and something that I would encourage you to check in on their website for the latest. But I know that having that data in order to inform the reality of what's happening is very much front and center on their advocacy list of priorities.
Excellent. And I'll open this up, as we don't want to assume anything as well, concerning ageism. I'm a 41-year-old graduate nurse. I'm concerned that I will have difficulties with finding employment due to my age and inexperience. What advice can you offer for me to overcome this concern? Catherine, do you think you could take that one first?
Yeah, where I come from, we always say age is just a number. And so what you have to do is first of all, I don't know what country you're from, but if you're in the United States, age discrimination is illegal. And you have to find where you might think you might have the best goodness of fit. And then you go in and you sell yourself. And it is your behavior and what you do in the system that nobody will ask you how old you are. I mean, they'll see it from your records, but it can't discriminate against you because of that. But listen, the majority of nurses, at least in the United States, are 40 and above and drive this whole system. So you've got a lot of folks. When I talk about ageism, I'm talking about folks over 65, not you 40-year-olds are young people in this whole global aging community. So I don't think you should have any problems, to be very honest with you. I have a lot of older students graduating from our masters, some 50, 60, and they don't have problems getting jobs.
And if I could jump in here too, I think one thing to add to that is, as a second career nurse, you know, it was a value to be able to go into an interview and sell some of the stories that I learned in the business world before coming back into healthcare. So don't be afraid to look at your prior experience as an attribute and a benefit, because it really is. You're coming with a unique skill set, perspective, viewpoint that maybe not every other, you know, person in your graduating class would have. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about the value of mentorship. It's, you know, that's another great way to explore getting over that first hurdle of like, I'm a graduate, but I don't necessarily have a ton of experience yet. So tap into the circles that you can get into. And like I said, tell the story of why what you did previously makes you a better nurse today. And that's really powerful.
Thank you. And Art, along that same line, we have another question. What drew you to the nursing profession as a second career nurse? So it's a great segue.
Well, I have to admit, this is actually a return to nursing. I knew I wanted to do this when I was younger. And I think like most college kids, got a little distracted, maybe didn't have the right grades, for, you know, to be in a very competitive program. So I walked away from it, and ultimately it was the earthquake in Haiti in 2010 that really reminded me that I was supposed to be a nurse. It was time to go become a nurse. And I can tell you exactly where I was that day, thinking I would give anything to get on an airplane right now, because my job is to go help people. And so I left corporate America in 2010 and began the process, which was slow and difficult at times, taking prereqs again. But, you know, I think the value of coming into a thing like nursing is you will never be bored. You will almost never be unemployed. There are opportunities endlessly, and there are some of the smartest, most caring people that I've ever met. So when you think about being able to work with amazing coworkers, to always have the freedom to continue growing and exploring into a different branch of nursing or a different part of healthcare, you know, nursing for me was such a natural choice that I knew it when I was younger, and I just didn't listen to my gut. And it's funny how life has a way of reminding you the path that you should be on.
Excellent. Dawn, that question was also specifically directed to you.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
drew you to the profession?
So I graduated in my undergraduate degree with anthropology, and just, you know, always had a real interest in cultures and biology, and then kind of wasn't sure which path I wanted to go down. And then my first job in the healthcare field, as I mentioned earlier, was as a nursing assistant, and was still kind of fluctuating back and forth about what I should be. And honestly, I have to say, like, working with the nurses and closely with the nurses is what really drew me to nursing, is because I was just absolutely, you know, every day astounded by the amount of autonomy and respect and, you know, how smart they were. And they very quickly, you know, convinced me that nursing was the only way to go, and that of course I was going to be a nurse. And I haven't looked back since. I have found so many great mentors, friendships, opportunities. It's been completely endless, and I highly encourage, you know, anybody that's thinking about it, if they haven't already gone back to school and are thinking about becoming a nurse, to go for it.
Excellent. How can we help our young children to influence them to go into the profession of nursing? Jennifer, would you like to start with this one?
Sure. You know, again, I think we talked a bit about, you know, how we need to really change the image of nursing so that it's an attractive position that is technical, that is, you know, that engages youth, that's exciting. Nurses practice to their fullest extent of their capabilities. They're not limited by, you know, narrow nurse practice acts, that they're seen as leaders. And I think that that goes a long way in order to, not just within the United States, but globally, to change that image so that this is a field that people want to pursue. I think, unlike Arik, I didn't really know much about nursing. It was my first degree and my first career, but I was actually dissuaded by quite a few people when I began, who said, "Oh, but you're too smart for that. You're supposed to go to medical school." And I said, but, you know, I look at the role of the nurse, and it's different. It's not just like medical school light. This is a different field, and it's one in which I want to be an anchor for my community, and I want to be that person who's there in community, who's there at bedside. And I think, as Dawn just said, that's exciting. And so when we can highlight these different roles that nurses can play, a mentor once told me, if you're bored in your nursing job, you got to find the next one, because there's really no reason to be bored, that there are so many different types of practice and areas to practice and ways to leverage your skill set, that it's just a matter of finding the fit. And so if we can tell that story of nursing to the public, that this, the change that image in the media, I think will go a long way to attracting youth into the profession.
Any other thoughts on how we can help our young children and influence them to go into the profession? Okay, I'll move on. How do we attend to the mental health of the nurses after this pandemic? I work on a COVID-19 unit in San Diego, and we are all under pressure and just pulling through day by day, but we will need a break after this. Catherine, do you think you could start with that one?
Yes, I can tell you, being here at the epicenter in New York, what many of our institutions have done is even now, as it's ebbing for us in New York State, they're having groups come together with either a nurse clinician or a psychiatrist to have the nurses, and they're doing it all electronically by Zoom. That's the group that I talked to the other night, but having them just talk out their feelings. And if the psychiatrist feels that it would warrant additional kinds of referral, my understanding is they will get referred to that. We again have to say to the places where we work and to anybody who needs to hear what we have to say, that we have got to look out to forming these kinds of group for ourselves, that we need to tap in to what's available, either through your institution or form your own group and get somebody to lead it so that you have an opportunity to do and talk about it. We should not be going through pounding our chests, living with this stress. One of my students saying to me the other night, "Oh, I wish I could have done something so he didn't die alone." But there was nothing that could be done because no visitors were allowed. And so you can't live with that. You just understand you were there when he needed it. His family understood that. You were there when he needed it. You and everybody else did the best you could. So we need to be able to have an opportunity to talk about that. And so we must insist that we should have those groups. I'm sure you got plenty of folks out there in California who, if you're in one of those collective bargaining units, will make sure it happens on your behalf.
In the Philippines, the government imposed a ban on deployment of Filipino nurses who wish to work abroad during this COVID season. They want to keep the nurses in the Philippines to avoid depleting the supply of nurses in the Philippines. What is your opinion on this? I'll open that up to anyone.
They're right. They're right. They're very right. They have their own problems, and just because we were saying here, I can't speak for any other state, but in New York, we were saying, we'll give you all this extra money. You get a bonus for this. But we have to, again, remember where the issues start. And if that community is having a problem, it maybe the way they did it may have been harsh, but they need to be able to look out for their community. And I don't know that they would have gotten into the United States with all the changes in the immigration and ICE's regulations anyway. So it's a double-edged sword.
How common is sexual violence and harassment at work among nurses in America and globally? It will be very interesting to conduct that study in Malawi.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on that. And I think this is something that we are increasingly starting to generate the evidence for in in higher income countries, particularly in the States, and be happy to, we I'm not sure that what I'm familiar with isn't necessarily disaggregated to the level of the nurses, but it's quite high. It's more than a third of health workers have experienced some form of workplace harassment and violence. But I think it is important and would be very interesting to look at that across cadres and to understand that for nursing specifically. And I think, the research, this is a huge area of opportunity for more research in low and middle income countries. And I think that, we are starting to hear donors call for this type of gender analysis in our work when we're working in pre-service, and in-service training grants, to be able to understand these barriers better. But we also know that this is it's really tricky to put your finger on the accurate numbers because it's so underreported for really understandable reasons. Many people have stigma and barriers and fears about coming forward, fears for their own lives, if they come forward because of the current situations that just there isn't accountability or legal structures in place to support them if they do disclose. So it's really difficult anywhere in the world to get a perfectly accurate picture on this, but we know it's something that is critical to continue to strive to understand better.
Thank you so much for all of your questions and for participating today. Becky, I'll be turning it back over to you now.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. Again, thank you so much to our presenters today for all the great information and all the questions and comments submitted. Sigma and Jhpiego are grateful that you took the time to share with this audience and look forward to hearing more from you in the future. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. Be sure to check out Sigma's upcoming webinars, podcasts, and resources to support you and your colleagues at sigmanursing.org. Also, previously recorded webinars and podcasts are freely available on the Sigma repository. So thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.